Okay.
Okay, hey.
Calling Chris Anderson. Wake up, Chris. Calling Chris Anderson in London.
I'm in London. I'm in London. I promise. I promise. You're calling Rick Byer in Chicago.
In Chicago. How are you? Greetings.
Greetings. How are things?
Doing great here in Chicago. So this is an encore episode.
Right. So, are you in Chicago now?
I'm technically not in Chicago now. I'm in Boston. And where are you?
I'm in Spa. No,
But
Clairvaux.
but we've sent our spectral images
Yes.
in to pretend that we're still in Chicago and Boston. Welcome everybody to the spectral edition of History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, which offers tours where, Chris?
Europe, Asia, America. Anywhere else?
Yes, no. Check it out at stephenambrosetours.com.
All over the place.
Yeah, and listen, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast.
Yes, I remember that.
Thank you for joining us. And today we'll be talking about African Americans in World War II. And hey, thanks to all of our top shelf patrons.
Absolutely, as always.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being here. It's Christmas time, so if if the Christmas top shelf patron spirit fills your heart watching this show, you can become a top shelf patron by going to patreon.com/History Happy Hour.
That would be
Yeah.
what a better way to say happy holidays.
So, and what are you doing in Clairvaux? Clairvaux is in Luxembourg, right?
It is. I'm going to be leading the Battle of the Bulge trip for Stephen Ambrose. So I leave tomorrow, and I'll have 9 days in the Ardennes. Be there for the anniversary, so that's always really good. And it's actually kind of appropriate that our topic this week is about African Americans, because I'm going to make it a point to go see some sites associated with African Americans during the Ardennes campaign. So,
Well, it's the 79th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge,
yes, it is.
which starts on December 16th.
Yes.
And December 16th is also the day that the Boston Tea Party took place.
Get out!
250 years ago.
Wow.
So that is what I will be in
It's
Boston
like a karma thing.
with a group of hardy souls for the Boston Tea Party Symposium. I am there right now. It's happening. We're halfway through it. Maybe we're almost finished. Maybe we're done.
Preaching lies and sedition.
I think we're done. I think it was yesterday, right? So okay. Chris, desperately need to get to the show before we lose every viewer we have. So give me a signal and we'll get started. Okay. Boom. There you go.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Let's start. More than 1 million Black men and women served in World War II, and Black troops served in segregated units, performing unheralded but vital support jobs, only to be denied housing and educational opportunities during and after the war. And the stories of these Black veterans have long been, if not ignored, then at least not paid enough attention to, cast aside in favor of the myth of the good war fought by the greatest generation. So historian Mathew Delmont has taken an unblinking look at this chilling story in his new book, Half American, the epic story of African Americans abroad, African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. And it's a wide-ranging look at the African American experience in World War II. And as mentioned last week, Mathew is a professor of history at Dartmouth College.
Where's that?
Yes, and he's a Guggenheim Fellow and expert on African American history and the history of civil rights. Mathew, welcome to History Happy Hour. Add to stream. There we go.
Yeah.
There you are.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
We're happy to have you. I am a Dartmouth graduate. So
Go Big Green.
Class of 9. I'm wearing green. Right here.
He does all the time.
Class of 1978. Yes, I mentioned it every 30 or 40 seconds.
Yes.
And so as soon as I found out you were a Dartmouth professor, even before I knew what the book was, we wanted to have you on. So
Awesome. I appreciate it.
Okay,
Right.
fantastic. You have written 4 other books. This is your first book about World War II. So we'll start you off easy before we get into the super hard questions, which is to say, what What led you to do this? What made you want to write about the Black experience in World War II?
So all my books are about African American history and American history in some way. But this book really grew out of my last book project, which is a project called Black Quotidian, where I was looking at everyday history in Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. And so in the course of doing that research, when I looked at these newspapers from the war years, I kept coming across pictures and stories of just the average Black people who served in World War II. Whether it was Minneapolis, Cleveland, Los Angeles, New York, there kept being these kind of snapshot photos and little profiles of so-and-so from this neighborhood has just joined the Navy, or so-and-so has just been drafted in the Army, so-and-so is a Marine now. These weren't famous people in any way, but seeing those first dozens of these stories and eventually hundreds of them, it just made me curious, because obviously I'm a historian, I've taught about this topic for more than a decade, but I hadn't seen this many pictures and names and stories of the Black Americans who served in World War II. And so it made me curious. It was about 7 years ago I was finishing that last project. And so it led me to start poking around and seeing, what more is there to the story about Black Americans in World War II that isn't in our textbooks or isn't showing up in my own lectures. And that's what really kind of sparked my interest and curiosity in starting the research that became Half American.
Were you at all surprised that a topic that's so well covered, American World War II, that you were surprised that you were coming across these pictures, that it was like this almost silent part of the story?
I was surprised. And I mean, we do have a number of good books on Black Americans in World War II. The Tuskegee Airmen obviously are well covered. Right. There are good books on Doris Miller, a number of books on the 761st Black Panther Tank Battalion, and then some other kind of specialized studies on some of the different units. And so I don't want to say that there aren't good studies out there. But when you think about a U.S. history textbook, the kind of like standard that we would use in a high school classroom or in a college classroom, usually the Black contributions to World War II get a couple paragraphs at best. There'll be a reference to Tuskegee Airmen, maybe a reference to Doris Miller, Pearl Harbor, but the broader contours of that story just aren't really there. And so I think in part it was just the averageness of these folks who are being featured in the newspapers I mentioned. They weren't famous in any way. They weren't necessarily Medal of Honor winners or anything like that, but that's what made me excited and kind of curious, like what is there? What did it look like for an average 20-year-old from Cleveland, 18-year-old from Birmingham? Like what was their story like?
Yeah.
You write early in the book, you say, when I started digging into the archival records and military documents regarding Black troops, it became clear to me not only that African Americans served bravely during the war, but that the United States would not have won World War II without the contributions of Black troops. Can you give us a broad overview of what the contributions of Black troops are that kind of lead you to that point of view?
Yeah, it's an important argument in the book. It's actually not an argument I anticipated making when I started the research. But when you actually get into the details here, Black troops, by and large, were not in combat roles. There were a number of units that we can talk about that were combat units. It's Montford Point Marines, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Tank Battalion I mentioned earlier, some of the infantry units that get drafted later in the war. But by and large, the contributions that Black troops make are to the supply and logistical efforts that helped America and the Allies win the war. So I think the best example here would be the Red Ball Express, the group of truck drivers who helped to move more than 400,000 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel in the months after D-Day. It was this kind of behind-the-scenes work, whether it was driving trucks, clearing jungles, building runways, building these massive roads in India and in Alaska. It was dirty, unglamorous work, but it really was the kind of vital infrastructure work, supply work that helped America and the Allies win the war. And so part of the argument the book makes is that when we think about World War II, it wasn't just a battle of strategy and will, it was a battle of supply. Yeah. If we take it from that perspective, then I think the contributions of Black Americans become all the more clear. And so I think we're coming up on the anniversary of the D-Day invasion, obviously, and as you know better than anyone else, D-Day just stood for Day of the Invasion, right? And so there's still D-Day +1, D-Day +2, and it was the weeks and months after that that really helped to turn the tide of the war. The reality is the push of the American Allied troops across France and Germany wouldn't have been possible without these Black supply troops, because they were the ones loading the ships that were going to cross the channel, unloading the ships, loading them on the trucks, driving those trucks. Everything passed through the hands of at least one Black American. And so from that perspective, the reason I make the argument in the book that America couldn't have won the war without these Black troops is it was a supply war. If you understand it from that perspective, then the contributions of Black troops become all the more apparent.
Yeah. So, and kind of picking up on the roles of Black troops in World War II, I wanted to ask you about a book or a study that was done in the 1920s by the War Department. It's called The Use of Negro Manpower in War. And I would like you to kind of say what that was and what impact that had on the deployment of Black troops in World War II, why they wound up in those supply roles.
So it's a really important and troubling document that was produced in the 1920s. The use of manpower in the Army drew on the recollections and the experiences of white officers who had served in World War I, and asked them for their perspectives on how Black troops could best be used in future military conflicts. A lot of what comes across in that document, though, is the racial pseudoscience of the era. And so if you read it, there are a series of deeply upsetting claims that say things that the Black cranial capacity is smaller than the white cranial capacity, that Black troops are scared of the dark, that they'll run at the first sign of combat. Just a series of some of the most racist stuff you can imagine. Right. But that was the thinking of military leaders of the day. I think that the problem with that was that it wasn't just a handful of isolated cranks who were offering up these opinions. Like, this was the official doctrine of the right. U.S. Army and the U.S. military. It was taught at West Point, and it was taught over several generations. And so it really becomes the baseline assessment of the capacities of Black Americans. It's part of why between World War I and World War II, Black Americans get pushed out of the military. The percentage of Black Americans in the service actually declines because white military leaders don't think Black Americans have the intelligence, courage, or characteristics to be able to serve the kind of roles that the American military needs them to serve. And so it really is the kind of foundational document that helps to train the perspectives that a lot of the white officers who go on to serve in World War II, they have when they're thinking about, how can Black Americans help to contribute to this war effort. It's a deeply disturbing document to go back and read, and it was deeply disturbing for Black Americans at the time. Those who learned about it and understood part of what was being shared there knew that this didn't accurately represent the kind of contributions that Black Americans had made during World War I. It didn't certainly represent the kind of contributions they could make to World War II.
Well, I'm going to just follow up really quick, and I'm afraid I probably know the answer to this, but when that book came out, or when that report came out, the people that are compiling it had been in France in World War I, and there had clearly been African-American troops that performed magnificently. It sounds stupid to even have to remind people, but they'd performed magnificently in all of America's wars. So did you come across anything when that report's coming out from anybody in the armed forces or anybody to say, hey, wait a minute, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so the report itself it's an internal report. So it's not the kind of thing that showed up publicly as an op-ed in the New York Times, but it circulates widely enough in the military that Black veterans and Black troops are aware of it. And in one of the groups that's outraged are Black World War I veterans, because they were there. They're the ones who got shot.
Right.
And so there's another good book that just came out recently by a historian named Chad Williams called The Wounded World. That's about W.E.B. Du Bois and his recollections of World War I and trying to right these wrongs, try to write these stories. But that whole generation of Black veterans who served in World War I, they're outraged to see their own service be disparaged in this way, because there's more than 300,000 Black Americans who served in World War I. And so there was pushback because Black people at the time recognized what was happening. Those who had been in the military, those who were eager to volunteer to serve in the military, they recognized that they're being pushed out of the service. And so they're among the first to push back against a lot of the racist assumptions in this report.
One of the things that really, you were talking about that report, and one of the things that really struck me was the unsubtle language of white racism during this period. I mean, unsubtle is the nicest way I can put it to say it. In the wake of the 1944 Supreme Court decision striking down the whites-only primary elections in Texas, you hear all sorts of comments from angry senators about how we are going to fight to preserve white supremacy, and our soldiers are fighting for white supremacy and the ability to have elections the way we've always had them. And I mean, you just read comment after comment on this. It's pretty rough stuff to hear, and this just isn't that long ago.
Exactly. I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's sometimes easy to talk in the abstract about racism in the past or white supremacy in the past and think, oh, these were just things that maybe they're circulating, but like maybe people didn't really believe them. They really believed them. Right? They weren't shy at all about saying them publicly. I think one of the quotes I have in the book is from James O. Eastland, the senator from Mississippi. In the summer of 1945, just as the war is ending, on the floor of the Senate, he openly disparages Black troops and talks about how they've been a disgrace to their country. And he says that he believes firmly in white supremacy. He has the purest form of white blood in his veins. These are people in elected office. Like, again, these are not isolated cranks. These are people who are making decisions that profoundly shaped the direction of our country. And they were explicitly white supremacists. I think that it's an important thing to remember about that time period. And I think it's part of what I hope the larger goal of this book is to refocus our attention on the reality of what race and racism looked like during World War II. I think there's one of the myths that we have about World War II is that America was a more unified place during that time period. And that's true in some small ways, but the reality when we look at race and racism is that it was a deeply, deeply divided country. There were racial attacks and race riots all across the country. You had a whole region of the country that still explicitly practiced Jim Crow segregation. And then you had other forms of racial discrimination happening in the Northwest and Midwest. And I think some of those quotes that you mentioned, I think they help to give us just a clear sense that this was the tenor of the day. This wasn't something that was isolated. This was fully part of the mainstream.
Well, something else that I found really compelling in the book that you brought out was the Black community in America. They're pretty finely attuned to not only what's happening in America, obviously, because they live it every day, but what's happening in the world. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the reaction of the Black community to Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia and the Spanish Civil War, and what that meant for that community as World War II starts?
Yeah, one of the important things of looking at the war from the Black perspective is we have to start the story before Pearl Harbor. Because if you look at a Black newspaper from the 1930s, whether it's 33, 34, 35, you see extensive coverage of the rise of fascism in Europe. Black Americans are among the first to recognize the really serious threat that Hitler poses, not just to Germany and Jewish people, but to the world, because they recognize that Hitler is explicitly drawing on American racial policies to help justify his treatment of Jews in Europe. And so every time a new policy is passed in Germany, whether it's the segregation of Jews on train cars, the theft of Jewish property, violence against Jewish communities, that shows up in Black newspapers. Black Americans understand it because they're experiencing a lot of the same kind of treatment here in the United States. And so they're among the first to call it out. And then some of the kind of flashpoints that show up in 1935, as you mentioned, Mussolini invades Ethiopia. That's a huge deal for Black Americans. It's kind of a ripple in white America in the New York Times or the white papers, but it's a huge deal for Black Americans because Ethiopia was the only independent Black nation at the time. And so this gets daily coverage in Black newspapers. Then when the Spanish Civil War happens, 1936, when Francisco Franco stages the military coup of the democratic elected government there, that's also a huge deal. And that actually prompts 80 Black Americans to join the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to go volunteer to fight in the Spanish Civil War. They're among the first to take up arms to literally fight against fascism. All of that's circulating in the years before Pearl Harbor. And so I cite in the book numerous headlines from Black newspapers saying World War II has already started in 35, 36, once you have these transgressions happening, the rise of fascism in Europe.
Yeah. One of the things that your book really makes clear is the role of the Black press in bringing to the fore all of these issues and making sure that people, at least the people who are reading the Black press, are paying attention to this. And I know it's also, you obviously did a lot of research in that press. So it's sort of, on the one hand, it's kind of it's part of the movement, and it's also part of how you find out about the movement. Can you expand on that and talk about that a little bit?
The Black press is absolutely vital to this story in a few different ways. One, as you're just saying, they really were trying to shape the history. So the Black press has always considered itself to be a fighting press. They weren't into both sides journalism. They understood themselves to be clearly fighting for the best interests of Black people. And that meant fighting against the kind of white supremacy we were just talking about. And so whereas I think it was just a couple of years ago, the AP decided to stop using things like racially tinged and say racist or white supremacist, the Black press was doing that as early as the 1930s and 1940s. If something was racist, they just came out and said it was racist. During the war, the Pittsburgh Courier launches what they call the Double Victory Campaign, which becomes really the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war, because they're fighting for victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. But the editors for the Courier and for other papers, they are really trying to shape the story. They're fighting to integrate the military. They're fighting to integrate the defense industries. And so it's not just they're reporting on the stories, they're actually trying to actively shape the stories. And the other thing that was important for the book is that the Black press had war correspondents. So Langston Hughes is a war correspondent for the Baltimore African American and covers the Spanish Civil War. During the war, there were war correspondents like Ollie Stewart, Tres Van Anderson, Roy Otley, who are embedded with some of these Black units. And they're writing stories back to the Black press that are circulating in the United States, talking about the really vital role that these different Black units are playing, whether it's the tank battalions or the Montfort Point Marines or the Red Ball Express that I mentioned earlier. Those give you an entirely different perspective of what the war looks like than what you'd get from a white newspaper at the same time. And so part of what was important for me about those sources is it gave me kind of frontline accounts from 1944, 1945, where you had these journalists writing about the really vital roles that Black troops were playing, but also writing about how these were already getting written out of the larger histories of World War II that were being crafted at the time. And
So they knew at the time that this was being kind of sort of erased as it was being written.
Exactly, because what they pointed to is it's not showing up in the New York Times, it's not showing up in the Chicago Tribune, it's not showing up in the newsreels. And then once some of the large magazines start publishing these volumes of photographs after the war, whether it was Life or Collier's, they had thousands and thousands of photographs, none of them of Black troops. Those journalists I mentioned, they're already talking about this. They're saying, look, we saw what happened, we saw the contributions that Black troops made, but it's being whitewashed. And so that's already in 44, 45, 46. It wasn't just historians like myself coming back later and saying, look what happened. They understood it in real time that this erasure was happening.
Chris, can I do a follow there?
Just this once, Rick. Never let it
Thank
happen.
you so much. Well, Matt, you sent us a bunch of pictures. I'm going to show some of them right now. And they are not in the book, but leafing through them gave me this remarkable feeling of living in an alternate universe. Because here are all of these Black people doing things that we see white people doing all the time in World War II. And yet, although I've seen a couple of these, this is an image that I'd seen before. I'd seen some of these images before. Seeing them all together was really, really powerful. And it kind of, it's just something we hardly ever see. And I wonder, when you look at these pictures and kind of contemplate these thoughts, what things do you think about?
I have a similar response to reaction to you. I mean, and one of the things that really excited me about doing this research is I've taught about this topic for, like I said, for more than a decade, but I didn't have these kind of images at my fingertips. It's still, if someone asks me about World War II and World War II veterans, the default image that pops in my head is a white person, is a white veteran. Part of what I hope the book can accomplish is getting more people to recognize the really vast contributions Black Americans made to the war. So when people start thinking about World War II, they think also about the contributions of Black veterans. But I think part of the importance of those images also is it gives you a sense of just how many different parts of the war Black Americans were involved in. They were in the Women's Army Corps. They were working on repairing trucks, repairing planes. They were in the defense industries. They were in every branch eventually of the military, all in segregated units. And that's the complicated part of this, is that they experienced discrimination in their military service, and yet they gave everything they could to help win the war militarily.
Yeah. So, Matt, where America's at war, the Black community, like all patriotic communities, they overwhelmingly volunteer to serve. They don't quite get the reception that they want to have. And you mentioned the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer referring to the most dangerous Negro in America. So who's the most dangerous Negro in America, and what part does he have to play in actually giving Blacks the opportunity to do what they want to do, which is serve their country?
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, the most dangerous Negro in America was A. Philip Randolph.
Yes.
Was the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was one of the most powerful Black leaders of the time period, because he's the head of the largest Black union in the country. In the lead up to World War II, summer of 1941, before America has joined the war militarily, but after President Roosevelt has announced that America is going to be the arsenal of democracy, everyone at the time understands what that means. It means jobs, thousands and thousands of new jobs, as these defense industries convert to producing tanks and trucks and ammunition, everything that America is going to need to help supply the Allies and eventually to help fight the war. Initially, Black Americans are locked out of those defense industry jobs by a mix of discrimination, open discrimination, and seniority policies that the unions have. Randolph recognizes that this is a very serious problem, and so he threatens to lead a march on Washington, where he says he's going to bring 100,000 Black Americans to march on Washington unless President Roosevelt agrees to pass non-discrimination provisions in these defense industries. And this is shocking and deeply, deeply concerning for Roosevelt and the White House, because they've never seen anything like it before. It's a threat of civil rights activism at a scale and a potential to embarrass the White House in America in a way that has just never been threatened before. Through a series of high-stakes negotiations behind the scenes, Randolph agrees to call off that march in exchange for Roosevelt passing an executive order that, at least on paper, has those non-discrimination provisions in it, helps to open up the defense industries to black workers. But part of what's so important about Randolph is that just by virtue of that threat that he can compellingly say he's going to bring this many Black Americans to Washington, D.C., he helps to demonstrate Black political power for the era. It helps to be a tipping point in terms of the kind of civil rights activism that develops over the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Everyone, of course, knows the 1963 March on Washington. That really draws on the blueprint that Randolph articulates in 1941. So even though that march doesn't happen in 1941, he lays the groundwork for it. And he's, by that point, kind of the grandfather of the movement in 1963. He lays the groundwork for that kind of activism that happens later.
Right.
We talked about some of the violent racism, the white supremacy comments, et cetera. You've just talked about Randolph and Washington and Roosevelt's kind of trying to wish away the march that Randolph had been organizing. And we have a question from someone in our audience, Nancy Nallens, who says, do you think FDR's dismissive reaction to this violent racism was out of political concerns, or does it suggest his own racism?
That's a good question. So I wouldn't say Roosevelt was out of the ordinary in terms of his own positions on race in the era, or his own racial prejudices. I think obviously Eleanor Roosevelt was more to the left of the president, and it really helped to push him to take more forceful action with regards to civil rights. So I think it was more political concerns than anything else. Roosevelt was obviously trying to balance a very delicate situation beyond just trying to lead the country through the war. He's trying to balance a delicate situation in his own party, because the Democratic Party during the war had both a rising African-American component to it as Black Americans increasingly left the Republican Party and moved to the Democratic Party and became more important swing voters in a number of Midwestern and Northern states. That was part of the Democratic Party. But then at the same time, you had the entire South was solidly Democratic and was explicitly segregationist. And so it was this delicate balancing act that Roosevelt was trying to achieve. And it obviously broke apart after the war with President Truman's decision to integrate the military. That's what leads to the South splitting off from the Democratic Party. During the 40s or early 40s, while Roosevelt's still in office, he's still trying to balance those things. I think that's more than anything else what led him to not take more forceful steps to address the kind of racism that was showing up both in the military and outside of it during the war.
So this is a letter in 1942, and it kind of talks about the WWII campaign. But there was a Grace Thompson who writes. I mean, I can't remember which one of the black papers it was, but he writes about, why should I shed my blood for a country that doesn't even recognize me? But it was a pretty important letter, and it kind of got the community thinking. So could you talk a little bit about sort of the attitudes, where that letter comes from, and the attitudes in the Black community as this crisis kind of unfolds on them?
Absolutely. It's actually where I drew the title for the book. So James Thompson writes this letter just weeks after Pearl Harbor. He's writing to the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the largest and most influential Black newspaper. And it's a deeply searching, profound letter. He says, in part, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase, should I sacrifice my life to live half American, it really stuck with me. It's why I chose Half American as the title of the book. What Thompson's asking, because he knows he and other Black Americans are about to be drafted into a segregated military. He's asking, what does it mean to be asked to fight for and potentially die for a country that doesn't yet treat you as a full citizen? Of course, Stephen Ambrose, one of the things he said about World War II is that the great irony of World War II is that you had the world's largest democracy in the United States fighting against the world's worst racist, Hitler, with a segregated army. Yeah. Men and women like James Thompson recognized that irony. They were living that hypocrisy in the war era. This isn't something that historians just recognize after the fact, but all Black Americans during World War II recognized this is messed up, right? That we're being asked, for lack of a better, more scientific sounding term, like this is messed up. We're being asked to fight for fight a war that, at least in theory, is about freedom and democracy, while we're not experiencing that same freedom and democracy here in the United States. Thompson's letter is what helps the Courier launch the Double Victory campaign. Right. And again, I think in the past I would have taught this more as just kind of a slogan as a rhetorical device. African Americans fought for double victory, but once I actually got into the research for the book, they really meant it. They really were fighting a two-front battle. They wanted to do everything they could to win the war militarily to help defeat
Right.
the Axis powers, but they recognized that wasn't enough. They also wanted to help fight a war to actually have civil rights and real freedom and democracy here in the United States.
Well, you talked, yeah, in fact, you talked about soldiers that don't get paid a lot anyway, taking like large percentages of their pay to send it to the NAACP so that they can fund the activity, which I found kind of remarkable, right?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite archival document finds for the war. So in the Ella Baker's papers, which are at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, so Ella Baker is this tremendous civil rights activist who helps the NAACP expand during the war. She's traveling all across the country, organizing local people to fight for their rights. But one of my favorite things I found in those papers were these letters that are written from troops who are stationed all across the world. They're in the Middle East, they're in the Pacific, they're in Australia, but they're also at Normandy. So there's a unit, a black unit, just like 4 or 5 months after the D-Day invasion in Normandy. They literally pass the hat around, or pass the helmet around, I suppose, to raise money to be able to send back to the NAACP. And in the letter they enclose, they say, we're doing everything we can to help to win the war here, fight against the Nazis, but we know that's not enough. We want to contribute to the Double Victory campaign. And so they sent something like $333.89, right, to help win this war. It's I think the most perfect encapsulation of the Double Victory campaign, because these are guys who are fighting the war militarily, but also want to help fund civil rights back in the United States.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Matt Delmont, who's the author of the book, Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. And I have to switch screens here to get to my question. But the question I wanted to put to you is one that was asked by a viewer here, and so let me find it. This is from Wally Morrison, and he says, how could the military function at its best when so divided by race? Was it the sheer loyalty by Black soldiers that they just did the jobs that they were given in order to win the war?
I appreciate this question because, again, one of my favorite things about being a historian is that you learn new things in the process of doing research, right? And so at the start of the project, I've taught my students, yes, the military was segregated during World War II, but during the research, if you just stop and think about what that meant, it made no sense, right? That there's no strategic or tactical reason to have a segregated military. In fact, it was costly and redundant and illogical for a military that's trying to fight and win a global war on the scale, because they had to do everything in duplicate. They had segregated latrines and segregated dining facilities and segregated barracks, and it was someone's job to maintain that segregation. The Red Cross literally segregated blood from blood donors, even though there's no scientific basis to do that. And so what I appreciate about the question is that there was no logical reason to segregate the military. Actually, it did make the military a less effective fighting force, because they turned away Black volunteers and draftees who had advanced language capabilities, who had scientific capabilities that could help them decipher messages or do radio communications. They turned away people with PhDs from Harvard just because they were Black. Roy Wilkins, who's one of the leaders of the NAACP at the time, had a quote that I include in the book. He said, white Americans would rather lose this war than give up the luxury of racial prejudice. And it's hard to find the lie in that, because if the United States was actually doing everything they could to help win the war militarily, they would have gotten rid of segregation in 1941. They would have said, we need to take advantage of the actual manpower or person power of every American citizen, and would have integrated the military in that way. The second part of the question about why did Black troops fight then? Part of it was loyalty. Part of it was also just the structure and the threat of military discipline. I think it's hard to give a percentage on what who falls on which side of that line, but for a lot of Black volunteers and draftees, they were deeply patriotic and they wanted to do everything they could to help win the war. And so even though they recognized the intense discrimination and racism they faced, they still took the role they had and did everything they could in that role to help win the war. And the other part is, once you're in the military, once you're drafted, people caught hell if they fought back and if they protested. And so another set of folks just kept their heads down, did what they did, tried to survive, just tried to get to the end of the war. And it's part of why a lot of Black veterans were really reluctant to talk about their experience in World War II, because they were disrespected in the military, and it wasn't a pleasant, uplifting experience. And so it took them decades to want to say anything about their experiences.
Yeah. So it's foolish to think that there's one black experience of World War II, and I'm not trying to say that there is, but perhaps just to kind of highlight or to use one example, could you talk about just one of the people that you studied in the book and kind of talk about his arc during the war and maybe what his experience was and how the war impacted him?
Yeah, I'll talk about someone who's well known. Medgar Evers
Okay.
is well known as a civil rights activist, but he was just 19 years old when his unit lands at Normandy, just days after D-Day invasion. He was part of that Red Ball Express I mentioned earlier. He helped to load cargo for those Red Ball Express truck drivers. And so I think his example is, I think, illustrative in some ways, that he was just an average teenager from Mississippi who gets drafted in the military, goes and serves in the military, does his job. Part of what's important about his story is, as his unit is moving across France, he has the opportunity to stay with a French family for about 2 weeks. And he said it was the first time he was ever treated as a full human being by a white person. It was entirely different than how he was treated by white Mississippians at the time. And so he said it really opened up his eyes to what was possible in terms of race relations. So the kind of things that he experienced in Mississippi didn't have to be that way. So he was an average black teenager, helped to do his part to load cargo that is part of that much larger supply effort that is really vital to the American war. Americans helping to win the war. He experiences more positive treatment in Europe, which was a commonplace experience for a lot of black troops. Then he comes home after the war and keeps fighting for civil rights, which was also a commonplace experience. On his 21st birthday in 1946, he led a group of black veterans who tried to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. And what he said later was that, he had been on Omaha Beach, that all he and other black soldiers wanted was to be treated as ordinary citizens. He had survived fighting against the Germans, but then came home and it looked like white Mississippians were going to kill him. Evers, of course, went on to take on increasingly important roles in the NAACP in Mississippi. He helped to investigate the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955 and kept fighting for voting rights and civil rights until he was assassinated in 1963. And Evers, like many other black veterans, was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors.
We had another question that I keep trying to bring in questions from the audience when we can. Question is, I read a similar account from black soldiers during the Vietnam War era, presumably about racism. So was there really any progress made to right these issues from World War II to the Vietnam War era?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'm at the early stages of doing some research on Vietnam now, so it's a question that is kind of near and dear to my heart. So there was a lot of change, and we could say a lot of progress. And one of the complicated things about the military is that there were many laudable things with regards to the military and the way they addressed racial issues. So as many people might know, in 1948, President Truman passes an executive order that leads to the desegregation of the military. It takes several years for that to actually become the reality on the ground, but by 1953, by the end of the Korean War, the military is fully racially integrated. I think that actually puts the military on a more leading perspective with regards to racial equity than most other institutions in American society. The military moves earlier and faster on racial equity than higher education or most of corporate America. So by Vietnam, the military really sees itself, with some good reason, as being the most racially integrated institution in American society. It's true in terms of the numbers, certainly at the enlisted and junior officer ranks. So I think on the kind of positive side of the ledger, the military has thought longer and harder about issues of racial equity than most other institutions at the start of the Vietnam War. On the other side of the ledger, the kind of day-to-day reality is black troops continue to encounter deep racism in the military that they talk about. They describe being called racial epithets regularly. They describe the Confederate flag being displayed on military bases, both in the U.S. and military camps in Vietnam. And then in several cases describe crosses being burned or white troops wearing KKK paraphernalia, just kind of very deeply upsetting racist incidents that keep happening during the Vietnam era. The other thing that happens at least at the start of Vietnam, black troops are able to take on different roles within the military. So they're overrepresented in infantry units at the start of the war. And so the number of black troops that are killed in Vietnam, at least in 65, 66, is higher than their percentage in the American population. And so that's concerning because it seems as though the opportunity to serve in the military is now going to lead to black Americans dying at a higher percentage. So I think the Vietnam case is an interesting one because the military does make a lot of progress between World War II and Vietnam, but there's still a number of underlying instances of racism that the military continues to try to address after Vietnam.
So, so speaking of, sort of facts on the ground, I guess, obviously these units are going to go into combat, and combat is going to happen. And blacks are involved in every major engagement that white soldiers are, as in some capacity. Can you talk a little bit about some of the combat roles that they perform? I mean, one of the things, like I know in 44, Eisenhower's suffering such high casualties that they start to have black platoons and white companies for a while, which is then kind of quieted up. But combat sort of changes. The necessity of war changes the situation too, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. So to highlight some of the Black Americans who have a chance to participate in combat, I think the Marine Corps is a good example. At the start of the war, the Marine Corps isn't allowing any Black Americans to serve in any capacity. The commandant at the time says he'd rather have a Marine Corps of 5,000 white Marines than 25,000 Black Marines. Finally, by late 1942, the Marine Corps relents and establishes the first cohort of Black Marines at Montford Point. So they become called the Montford Point Marines. They serve at Iwo Jima and Saipan and perform extraordinarily, to the extent that the next commandant of the Marine Corps says that they have proven themselves, that they are fully 100% Marines. So just in the course of 3 years, the Marine Corps does a 180 with regards to how Black Americans are going to serve. The tank battalion I mentioned earlier, the 761st Black Panther Tank Battalion, they serve for 160 days consecutively through 4 major campaigns, including the Battle of the Bulge, and do tremendous work to help do their part in the European theater. And then in terms of specific soldiers, of course, during the war, there are 433 medals of honor that are awarded. None of them are awarded to Black troops. In the 1990s, the military conducts a review and ends up promoting 7 Black Americans who had won the Distinguished Service Cross, promotes those to medals of honor. And so one of those was Edward Allen Carter Jr., who, if I had to vote for the most fascinating person to fight in World War II, Carter would get my vote. Carter was raised by Black missionary parents in India and China. Yeah. So he's fluent in in Hindi, Mandarin, and German, in addition to English. And he's one of these volunteers who ends up volunteering for infantry duty in late 1944. To go back a bit, when he was just 15 years old, he left home to serve in the Chinese National Army to fight against Japanese incursions in Shanghai. He's one of the volunteers in the Spanish Civil War. All that's before he turns 21. He volunteers for the Army before Pearl Harbor in 1941. And you would think with his language skills and the combat experience, the Army would have a good role to give him. Instead, they assigned him to be a cook in a quartermaster unit. And so he serves as a cook through the majority of the war until he volunteers for this infantry duty in late 1944, once the Army is desperate for more troops. He actually gives up his rank in order to do it. He goes from being a staff sergeant back to being a private. But I think Carter's example is a good one because he ends up performing heroically when he's given the opportunity in combat, but his skills had really been wasted previously as a cook. So the event that earns him this Medal of Honor is in March of 1944. He's attached to General Patton's tank division. He's in a provisional infantry unit that's attached to that tank division, so pushing across Germany, about to cross the Rhine. Carter leads a detachment across a field to try to take out this Nazi position behind a warehouse. And eventually he's the only one left. The 2 guys who are with him get killed. He's pinned down for nearly 2 hours, and it looks like these German troops are going to come and capture him. He ends up popping up, killing 6 of the German troops, and capturing the remaining 2. And I mentioned earlier he was fluent in German, so he interrogates those 2 Germans that he captures as he's leading them back across this field, ends up getting valuable intelligence about where the rest of the Nazi troops are positioned, and he relays that to his commander. It sounds like Hollywood movie stuff, but he actually did it. And I think it's just illustrative of the fact that, again, the illogic of segregation, right? Men like Carter, there were dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of men who could have performed at that same kind of capacity in combat if only given the opportunity, but they were denied it because of their race.
Go ahead, Chris.
I just want to, Lorelei Cam, one of our guests, had asked about, speaking of the combat roles, but the 11 Black soldiers murdered during the Bulge, that was a place called Wereth, and she wanted to know about whether they were in the infantry or in the Red Ball Express, and they were neither. They were in an artillery unit that got caught. But yeah, but they were very much in the front line of combat. I guess we're going to answer that.
Yeah. Are you waiting for an answer from him, or can I?
No, go. Jump.
Okay, just a little unclear. So there are two large black combat units that see action in Europe. And you mentioned the 761st Tank Battalion. There's also the 92nd Division, which fought in Italy. And they have very different experiences. And part of the reason for that is the attitude of their white commanding officers. So could you talk a little bit about that, and in particular about Ned Almond, who's the commander of the 92nd?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. So the 761st had a white commander, Paul Bates, who they respected tremendously. I think this is one of the real stories of World War II, and you'll talk about these black units. So we sometimes say that they're all black units, and that was true in part, but typically they had white officers. And the question of leadership really mattered. When they had white officers that respected them, the black troops recognized that, and they fought all the harder because of it. So the Black Panther Tank Battalion, they had a white officer who had the respect of his men, and it was repaid tenfold in the way that they fought. The 92nd was much more complicated. Almond, who was the commander of that unit, was openly racist and disrespectful to his troops. He didn't want to have them in his command, and he told them as much. And it was part of what led to their combat performance being not as consistent as I think the unit would have liked, and not as consistent as the larger military commanders would have liked, because they were, and the men said this afterwards, they were fighting for commanders who they didn't feel like they cared about whether they succeeded or failed. They didn't feel like they cared whether they lived or died, and didn't really respect them as soldiers or even as men. They would refer to the black troops by their first name rather than by their rank, and last name as would be the custom, and didn't feel like they had put them in the position or given them the training they needed to be able to fight in the kind of conditions that they end up fighting in. And so I think the 92nd is a complicated example, because depending on which reports you read, they either performed just at or slightly above average or performed well below average. And I think the reality is it was a mix of those two things. They're up against some very difficult units they're fighting against in very difficult terrain, and they were often sort of fighting these kind of engagements where they would move forward 50 or 100 yards and then get pushed back the same distance over the next couple of weeks. But I think the reality is, if they had commanders who gave them the kind of respect and training they might have warranted, their performance would have been better in the same kind of circumstances.
So Matt, I know, obviously, as you would expect, the African Americans or black soldiers, sailors, and Marines perform magnificently. They do their bit. They're patriotic Americans, and they come home. And I'm sure that's just changed everybody's attitude, hasn't it? So what happens when they come home? Has it materially affected their community? Or?
Yeah, I think we would like to think that it did, right? That all Americans rally together, the nation's unified. The victory parades include everyone, and everyone renounces the kind of racism that had been predominant prior to that. But sadly, we know that wasn't the case.
Right.
I think that's actually one of the hardest parts of the book to write. I have a chapter called Homecoming that talks about the open disrespect and violence that black veterans encountered when they came back to the United States. I think the reality is there were two competing visions for America in the years after the war. Black Americans were fighting that double victory campaign I mentioned earlier. They wanted to dramatically change the direction of the country. For a lot of white Americans, I think too many white Americans, the thing they kept saying in interviews and in public polling was they wanted to go back to the way things were before the start of the war. That was the exact opposite of what black Americans wanted. They didn't want to go back to a country that treated them as half American. They didn't want to go back to this segregation and not being able to buy homes and get mortgages. And so those two competing visions of the country come to a head in the years after the war. And so there were dozens of cases of violence, attacks, in some cases murder of black veterans, some also wearing their military uniforms. In all parts of the country, there was discrimination in terms of housing, in terms of schools, in terms of jobs. And that's part of what fuels the desire of black Americans to keep fighting for civil rights. So in the words of one black veteran, he went from fighting in the European theater of operations to fighting in the Southern theater of operations. I think that's part of the important story I think we have to tell about World War II is it was a watershed moment in so many ways, but the fight for civil rights, it took many, many years after the end of the war to really come to fruition.
And to kind of paraphrase a question from one of our viewers, did you get any sense that the wounds caused by the war, by the racism, not the physical wounds, but the sort of emotional wounds, uh, ever healed for some of these guys? I mean, or did many of them go to their graves sort of still bitter and angry about it?
That's a good question. I think for a lot of those veterans, it's not something that ever left them, the kind of anger and experiences that they encountered. One of the most familiar stories I've encountered in doing different talks since the book came out in October is hearing from Black people whose grandfathers or fathers or uncles served in the war, and they described either that they never talked about it at all, or they didn't talk about it until they were in their 80s and 90s, and when they did talk about it, they were angry, they were frustrated and mad at what they'd experienced. And I think part of that is that I can only imagine it was disorienting to have served one's country in that way, come home, and then not be invited to participate in the victory parades. Right? And then once all of the sort of idea of the good war and the greatest generation, all of the in many cases well-deserved praise gets lavished on that generation of veterans, it's usually pointed towards white veterans, right? And most of the discussions of the greatest generation tend to focus on the experience of white veterans. Much of that is well-deserved, but it should also include the contributions of Black veterans. And so I think for that generation to have experienced what they experienced, to live through it, and then feel like not only am I not getting acknowledged for it, am I not able to benefit from the GI Bill in the same way that white veterans are, I'm being ignored, or my contributions are being erased. It was deeply upsetting and disorienting. I think the one quote I think of related to this, one of the other people who was promoted to the Medal of Honor in the 1990s, the only one still alive to receive it in person, was Vernon Baker. He was part of the 92nd Infantry, who served in Italy. He said he was 77 years old when he finally got the Medal of Honor, and initially he didn't want to go to the White House to receive it in person because he said, I did this 5 decades ago. You should have honored me then when I was 24, not now. But the quote that stuck with me, he said, I was an angry young man. We were all angry, but we had a job to do and we did it. And I think that sense of anger never went away. I think Black soldiers, sailors, Marines, they recognized that the kind of treatment they received during World War II was unjust, and they were angry about it, but they still fought their butts off to help win the war. And I think for a lot of people, that anger never left them.
Yeah, we've touched on this a little bit in the conversation, but maybe we could expand a little bit on the whole civil rights movement, because I think in popular culture, we have this vision of in the 50s and 60s, they start marching in the South and they start registering voters, and it just kind of magically happens, right? But there's a long history there. And on other shows, we've had guests on talk about the long civil rights movement. Could you talk a little bit about some of the direct connections between these people that serve in World War II and they come back and they say, all right, that's it?
Yeah, so this book and my larger research is fully part of that long civil rights movement trajectory. So this book is squarely fits in that perspective. So A. Philip Randolph, I mentioned earlier, and he's part of the story, right? The kind of activism he does to threaten this March on Washington. There are March on Washington clubs and organizations all over the country, and so it's not just he's the figurehead, he's the leader of it, but there are organizers all across the country who are rallying people to potentially take on this march. Those individuals don't go away. Like this is a turning point moment for them in thinking about, we have the power to force the country to do things. We have the power to really demand our rights. During the war in the NAACP, two of the figures I mentioned in the book are Thurgood Marshall, who of course becomes the first Black Supreme Court justice, but during the war, he is the head of the legal division for the NAACP. So he's helping to fight these legal cases to help address the violence that Black troops are experiencing. He also helps to fight some of the voting rights cases during World War II, the Smith versus Allred case in Texas, 1944. And then one of the important grassroots organizers I focus on in the book is Ella Baker, who helped to organize local people all across the country to fight for their rights. She held leadership training workshops that trained hundreds and hundreds of people, including someone like Rosa Parks, who attends one in Atlanta in 1945. And so we often talk about World War II being a turning point for civil rights. I think what we need to understand is the infrastructure for civil rights got built out during World War II. And so whereas at the start of the war, Black people have always recognized that their rights are being violated and wanted to fight back to address that. But what happens in World War II is you have different communities starting to form branches of the March on Washington movement or the NAACP or the Urban League. Those become, if you think about a map of a country, you have these nodes all across the country who are prepared to fight for their rights locally and then to come together nationally. And so it's that infrastructure that gets built out during World War II that makes it possible, those larger movements in the 1950s and 60s.
Toward the end of the book, Matt, you write, if we tell the right stories about the war, we can meet the resurgence of white supremacy as a deeply entrenched aspect of our country's political history, rather than as a surprise or an anomaly. Can you expand on what you mean by that? And we're getting ready to wrap up the show, but can you kind of, as a finishing effort here, can you kind of tell us what you think about that and how that connects this story with today?
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of a longer answer to it. So when I started teaching in grad school, it was 2004. And at that point, it was less common, I won't say it never happened, but it was less common to hear people use explicitly racist terminology or explicitly racist phrases in popular discourse. Politicians tended to shy away from it. Media tended to shy away from it. And so part of the challenge of talking about racism was trying to explain that racism could still exist, even if there wasn't explicit racism circulating around. And so part of the way historians and others talked about racism was, how do you talk about racism when everyone claims to be colorblind? When I was writing this book, that was more into 2015, 2016, with the Trump presidency and a lot of other things that circulated around that, where it became a lot more commonplace for politicians and for media outlets and social media and other mainstream outlets to talk more explicitly about racist opinions and perspectives. That's what I mean by the resurgence of white supremacy, the kind of marches in Charlottesville and elsewhere. We have to be able to talk honestly about the history of World War II to recognize America has never been a fully unified country. I think there's a myth sometimes about World War II as being the good war. It was certainly a war America had to win, but when you look at the reality of what America was like in 42, 43, 44, it was a deeply fraught, deeply divided country. I think if we can look back and talk honestly about that and talk about how generations of Americans fought to change that, fought to make America really a country that was worth fighting for, I think we're more well positioned to talk about a lot of what we're still confronting now. A lot of the kind of racist perspectives, racist policies that we're still living with now, they are an outgrowth in some way of what we experienced, what the country experienced during World War II. And I think my obligation as a historian is to try to provide us with an evidence-based history that can give us the materials we need to understand why the country looks the way it does today, and then hopefully how we might be able to chart a different path into the future.
Mathew Delmont, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Matthew's the author of the book Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II. And there's lots of great stories in there and great accounts of all sorts of things, including the Lido Road, which I had, if I'm saying it right, which I had not heard of. So, Mathew, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour.
Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed our conversation.
All right. May I stick around? Well, we'll do our teary goodbye, but stick around and we'll do a proper goodbye at the end.
We'll say goodbye to you off the air, so hang on there.
So that was another great episode from the archives.
Yes, sobering.
Next week, we're going to be bringing on Christmas Eve, the very Christmassy topic in another encore episode. We're going to bring you Stephen Zaloga talking about Pointe du Hoc and his book, Smashing Hitler's Guns, because what else says Christmas?
For happy holidays, yes.
You know, I can just see the lights on the point and the whole... Okay.
Well, if we could find it, we got to get an author to come in and talk about the Christmas truce, because that would make
then we could run that every Christmas.
Every Christmas, that could be like our Christmas special.
From now till whenever the day that History Happy Hour leaves the air.
Hush your mouth.
Okay, yeah, that day could never happen. Listen, thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and look, browse historyhappyhour.com for 175 episodes. Check them all out.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.